Pleased to introduce our next panelist. This is Drew Fedorka, who is a PhD candidate at New York University. Like Tamara, he is the recipient of several fellowships and grants, most recently a McCracken Fellowship from the NYU Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, and also a Dean's Fellowship Program, NYU Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. His most recent publication is an article entitled Reframing Chanson, Recent Cultural Histories of French Popular Music in Cultural History, published this year. His paper today, and I hope I get this right because he emailed it to me, is called Dedicated Followers of Fashion, André Courrèges, Youth and the Boundaries of Haute Couture in 1960s Paris. Drew.
Thank you for the introduction. So I did change my paper title, and I was trying to figure out a kind of a thoughtful way to explain it away, but then Tamara just explained. So anyway, disregard what's in the panel, but in the panel, my goodness, in the program. That said, so I start this presentation with the altogether banal observation that fashion reflects the time and the place of its creation, and that the dominant aesthetic sensibilities of an era can tell us something about the underlying social and cultural logic of that era. As scholars like Mary Lou Roberts have shown, the rise of the garçon in the 1920s, with her bobbed hair, short dresses, and androgynous accents, seem to underscore, for critics and admirers alike, the new society born of the ashes of World War II. When Christian Dior introduced his new look, in 1947, with its appeals to a seemingly timeless elegance, he produced an aesthetic well-suited to the conservative social and gender norms that came to typify the 1950s. The 1960s, then, with its decidedly youthful shift in fashion sensibilities, seemed to signal the unstoppable ascent of a post-war baby boom generation as a central force for change. The general narrative suggests that a new generation coming of age in the 1960s disavowed haute couture, which they saw as old-fashioned, in favor of newer, fresher, ready-made clothing. This youth quake, as it came to be termed, announced the arrival of adolescence as the dominant influence in dictating new fashions. It was, as Valerie Steele writes, quote, probably the first time that fashions were being set primarily by young people. A moment when, quote, the entire structure of the fashion system was challenged from below. London, not Paris, became the new fashion mecca, as its vibrant Chelsea and Soho boutiques proved well positioned to respond to the newfound demand for ready-made and youthful clothing. It is in this context that historians often frame André Courrèges, who, with his space-age collections, seemed the only Parisian couturier in step with the sweeping changes reshaping the fashion system. For those of you unfamiliar with him, Courrèges was an influential designer of the 1960s, remembered most famously as one of the creators of the miniskirt alongside the English designer Mary Quant. It is for this reason that historians frequently group him in this larger youth quake narrative. As the co-creators of the miniskirt, albeit in vastly different contexts, Courrèges and Quant are often retrospectively viewed as the first designers to embody the vibrant and youthful undercurrents that came to define the 60s zeitgeist. This tidy framing tends to preclude a thorough consideration of Courrèges within a broader context of French history. Returning to my observation that fashion is reflective of the era that creates it, I argue that Courrèges embodies another aspect of the French 60s that up to this point has not received enough attention within histories of fashion. I suggest that Courrèges was less a product of the ascendant youth culture emerging during the 1960s and more a product of the disruptive forces so often associated with the so-called Trente Glorieuses. Scholars like Kristen Ross have stressed the rapidity with which French society was remade in the post-war era. Broad economic and demographic growth collided with a zealous modernizing ethos to produce new norms and practices across numerous facets of daily life. On a cultural plane, this transformation also rendered visible a tension between two imagined Frances, one modern, urban, technocratic, and forward-looking, the other traditional, rural, nostalgic, and at times reactionary. I argue that André Courrèges encapsulated, indeed promoted, a certain notion of modern France and fashion's place within it. Youth was, of course, central to this story. Again, the traditional narrative suggests that it was young people who, through their sheer influence, reshaped fashion and their image. And to be sure, young consumers exerted a newfound economic clout that we cannot dismiss. But as scholars like Richard Jobs have demonstrated, the very concept of youth took on a life of its own in the post-war context. According to Jobs, the category of youth provided a rich symbolic way to articulate and envision social and cultural change. Taking up Jobs' argument, I question how the concept of youth, understood as an imagined agent of change, found expression within the marketplace during France's transformation into a mass consumer society. To that end, I suggest that Courrèges produced an ideal of youthfulness, one that did not always correspond obviously to the needs and wants of young consumers, but which did reflect assumptions about what a modernized French fashion should look like. Youth became an omnipresent signifier, one consciously and consistently grouped with other important concepts like newness and modernity. I suggest that emphasizing a youthful aesthetic without reference to the past helped legitimate Courrèges' own self-fashioning as a new sort of couturier, well adapted to a new fashion system. Roland Barthes, the intellectual and chronicler of modern life, summed it up well, writing in a 1967 article for the women's magazine Marie Claire. He contrasted Courrèges with an older, venerated couturier, Coco Chanel. If Chanel represented for Barthes a certain timelessness, it was Courrèges whose, quote, voluntarily very young fashion was, quote, continually new without complication because it clothed new beings. His space-age designs, geometric lines, and unconventional textiles wrapped in an eye-popping white championed a youthful aesthetic without reference to the past. By contrast, Chanel, in the twilight of her illustrious career, remained committed to upholding a familiar style and standard of elegance. An iconoclast in her own right some 4 decades earlier, by the 1960s, she had become the embodiment of tradition within the world of haute couture. Several months earlier, she had come out resolutely against the miniskirt. Pitting the designers against each other, Barthes framed them as diametrically opposed embodiments of sartorial sensibility. Quote, timeless chic opposed to the new, quote, tradition opposed to innovation. Though Barthes was speaking in purely aesthetic terms, his comment about being continually new without complication bears further scrutiny. Unlike older, more established couturier, Courrèges felt no obligation to perceived notions of tradition or continuity. This embrace of newness and change, so often encapsulated in a youthful presentation, bode well for Courrèges' continual adaptation to France's growing mass market. From the outset, Courrèges portrayed himself as a new sort of couturier. At the height of his fame in the mid-60s, he regularly donned pristine white lab coats and smocks, his workshop, where he tended to client fittings, and salon, where he showed new collections, were similarly outfitted with bright white walls, drapes, and decor. And I like this picture of him tending to a fitting for Françoise Hardy, who of course was a sort of young pop star from the mid-1960s, and she was one of his regular clients. So that very much encapsulates the idea I'm trying to get across. The ambiance of both the salon and the workshop was sterile and meticulously planned, lending itself well to the futuristic connotations Courrèges purposely evoked. The intended effect was not lost on fashion reporters, who regularly likened him to engineers, technicians, electricians, architects, even dentists. When he spoke of his influences, he often listed Le Corbusier as his greatest inspiration. In his comportment and language, he cut the figure of the technocratic planner, so present in many other aspects of post-war French life, who took it as his mission to modernize and rationalize high fashion. This sensibility was, of course, most clearly articulated in his couture creations. His earliest collections, of which sleek pantsuits were the primary focus, gradually gave way by the mid-1960s to the full-blown Courrèges look: short skirts, flat-heeled leather go-go boots, geometrically patterned tops, and futuristic sunglasses. Fashion reporters described the, quote, architectural lines that distinguished his style, in which every detail was carefully planned. He was not only a couturier, but a, quote, architect and visionary. As Marie Claire wrote in 1965, he doesn't design dresses, he constructs them, describing his collections as geometry in space where nothing was left to chance. Courrèges describes his own work with with the same functionalist overtones. He likened his design challenges to that of architects. Quote, "Be it the construction of a house according to the needs of a family or the construction of a dress, the problem is the same. How best to fit in to what I call the modern grand design," end quote. He likewise shared the frankly arrogant presumption of expertise of post-war planners. While high-end designers were no strangers to promoting domineering visions for the female body, Courrèges nevertheless framed his own work in more technocratic terms. Quote, "I don't need to see the woman who will wear my clothes any more than an architect needs to build a house before he decides where he's going to put the windows. We can do all of that on the plan. I am a technician, and drawing is my manner of reflecting." End quote. His words indeed echoed the language of post-war architects whose sweeping vision for post-war housing frequently came into conflict with the needs and wants of inhabitants. Courrèges' attention to detail extended to the coloration of his garments. Like his workspaces, he chose white as the dominant color, as you can see, to unify and accentuate all of his collections. The uniformity and ubiquity of white in his designs lent them a hygienic and tidy appearance, which, to be sure, was the desired effect. The irony, of course, was that while the pristine white garments evoked symbolic notions of cleanliness, they also demanded the most of their owners to maintain that image. This, too, was by design. He reasoned that there was value in wearing white, quote, "if for no other reason than because a white dress shows dirt more clearly, thus necessitating that you wash it. That demands a certain hygiene." Courrèges further elaborated on the hygienic value of the color white in 1967. In an interview, he argued that, aside from its functional qualities, quote, "white means health and cleanliness, which I associate with beauty. Men wear white shirts, not black. Black soils as fast as white, except that the dirt on black shows less. But is it modern to be dirty? What thought could be more ugly?" Courrèges' assertions about the purported hygienic value of white brought into focus the swiftly changing hygienic norms, what our own Stephen Zatny has termed a hygiene revolution, that accompanied post-war France's heightened standard of living and its emerging mass consumer society. Courrèges' assumptions about good hygienic practice relied on widespread access to indoor running water, bathtubs, washing machines, and consumer products like shampoo and soap, all of which, only 2 decades earlier, would have been out of reach for broad swaths of the French public. These attributes, cleanliness, function, were coupled with an imagined youthfulness. Courrèges drew distinctions between 2 imagined women, one old, the other young, as a way to stress not only differing taste, but also entirely different ways of being in the world. Quote, "I cannot dress everyone. I cannot dress the Chanel woman, and I think she still exists." He noted, quote, "It is a question of age and habit. It is all a question of modernism." Youth, in Courrèges' sense of the term, came to mean adapted to the rhythms and norms of a new, fast-paced society in the process of being made. As he stated in 1965, quote, "The woman who interests me doesn't belong to any particular physical type. She lives a certain life. She is active, moves fast, works, and is usually young and modern enough to wear modern, intelligent clothes. She is often American. They are so much quicker at picking up new ideas than the French." At the same time, Courrèges cast himself as a new type of couturier in his approach to producing clothing. Since at least the 1950s, the haute couture industry had been under significant commercial strain. While elite fashion remained important to French national prestige, its mode of production and onerous trade union regulations proved poorly suited to the demands and expectations of the mass consumer society France had become. As the elite clientele of haute couture customers continued to shrink, so too did the corresponding numbers of distinguished fashion houses. As grand couturiers devised creative ways to staunch the loss of traditional business, they also grappled with the tensions between art and industry, raising questions about how to preserve the artisanal integrity of their creations while adopting the industrial techniques necessary to produce for a wider audience. Courrèges, like numerous other couturiers, faced familiar problems from legal and illegal copies to high production costs. Yet while many of his colleagues enacted defensive conservative measures to stymie unauthorized production, Courrèges devised new solutions. In the early 1960s, for instance, other famed couturiers like Yves Saint Laurent began to schedule their collection showings only after their productions had shipped to clients and professional buyers in an effort to forestall cheaper reproductions. At a time when new distribution and production techniques were deemed essential to the modernization of France's economy, commentators lamented these couturiers' stubborn reluctance to produce their own branded ready-to-wear that could be made available to French consumers immediately following collection showings. Writing in 1964, a fashion reporter in Le Monde underscored the irony that after a showing, a Parisian woman could immediately buy in London, New York, or Sydney that which in France, quote, she could only admire in French magazines, so long as France's methods of production and distribution remain archaic. Courrèges, by contrast, vocally advocated change to the industry's organization during the 1960s, often stating his intent to modernize the industry. While at the height of his fame following the introduction of his spring 1965 collection, he opted to close his fashion house, reorganizing it to be able to produce both hand-sewn couture garments as well as high-quality ready-to-wear. He finally returned after a nearly 2-year absence. His autumn 1967 collection showing became an opportunity to present himself at the forefront of not only fashion, a changing fashion taste, but also industry practice. He strove to create an atmosphere that suggested radical newness, unburdened by any sense of tradition or continuity, with youthful accents made tangible. His newly renovated salon traded the sterile decor of a laboratory for futuristic accoutrements. As pop music blared loudly from salon speakers, Courrèges' models emerged from behind the curtain, showing off his latest designs while gyrating manically to the latest teen dance craze, the jerk. These showings became a spectacle without precedent. As the visually stunning performances unfolded, something equally unprecedented occurred. Courrèges' models showed off his ready-to-wear garments, what Courrèges labeled his Couture Future collection, alongside his traditional couture designs. It was the first time that industrially manufactured clothing had been elevated to the same level as haute couture in a couturier's collection showing. After the showing, the ready-made garments were made available in his newly opened boutique located on the first floor of his fashion house, which sold off-the-rack clothing. Courrèges thus leveraged his fame as a grand couturier to bring attention to his ready-made garments. He also preserved an ethos of quality and distinction by maintaining tight control over the industrial production process and limiting the numbers of garments in any given style or color. The new boutique space was purposely distinct from the dowdy atmosphere associated with haute couture salons. Bright and inviting, it featured a young saleswoman fluent in English, ample business hours, and other incentives to encourage spending. It thus catered to an international audience of upper middle-class consumers. By no means the first couturier to open a boutique, Courrèges nevertheless added further legitimacy to ready-made clothing, and the boutique as a new and exciting site of consumption. Over the course of the 1960s, Courrèges fashioned himself as a new type of couturier, helping to initiate important changes within the industry. At the same time, youth was an ever-present aspect of Courrèges' work. It became a way to communicate ideas of newness and change within an industry where tradition and continuity was held in high esteem. As I have suggested, his preoccupation with youth was as much a matter of projecting a new fashion for a new France as it was for responding to the demands of young consumers. For too long, Courrèges has been understood only in the context of an ascendant young generation who desired their own distinct fashion. This focus, while no doubt partially true, places too much emphasis on the bottom-up influence of young people. Driven by the mundane observation that fashion reflects the time and place of its creation, I suggest that Courrèges also reflected another aspect of post-war French life. Driven not only by consumer demand by adolescents, he approached fashion with the clarity and focus of a modernizer intent on adapting the French fashion industry to a new, fast-paced age. For him, youth offered a potent signifier to stress the new, modern world he envisioned and for which he produced fashion to accommodate. Thank you.